while I was on vacation in Hawaii. My parents secretly sold my penthouse to pay off my sister's debts when I returned. They mocked me, "Now you are a homeless person." I just stood there smiling at them. "What is so funny?" they shouted. I quietly said the apartment you sold was actually a federal crime scene. They started screaming. The flight back from Maui to Atlanta had been long but peaceful. I was 33 years old, the founder of a rapidly scaling tech startup, and for the first time in years, I had actually taken 2 weeks completely off-grid. I felt recharged. My company had just secured a massive federal innovation grant to develop predictive software for urban infrastructure. Life was moving exactly as I had planned it. I dragged my designer luggage into the grand lobby of my building in Buckhead. The concierge, a young man who usually greeted me with a bright smile, looked away nervously as I passed. I thought nothing of it at the time, attributing his strange behavior to a long shift. I stepped into the private glass elevator that led directly to my 4,000 square foot penthouse. I punched in my secure key code. The keypad flashed red. Access denied. I frowned, assuming it was a glitch, and punched the numbers in again. Red light. Access denied. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I pulled out my phone to call the building manager, but just as I unlocked my screen, the elevator chimed. The heavy doors slid open. I stepped off the elevator and froze. My home, the sanctuary I had purchased with my own blood, sweat, and countless sleepless nights, had been invaded. Sitting on my custom velvet sofa was my mother, Yolanda. She was wearing her Sunday best, holding a crystal flute filled with my expensive vintage champagne. Standing behind her, looking entirely too comfortable in my space, was my father, Calvin. To their right stood my younger sister, Brianna, the undisputed golden child of our family, clinging to the arm of her husband, Connor. Connor was a legacy wealth finance guy, arrogant, born on third base, and utterly convinced he had hit a triple. He stood there in his tailored suit, looking down his nose at me in my own living room. "What is going on here?" I demanded, dropping my suitcase. "Why was my access code changed?" My mother took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne before setting the glass down on the marble coffee table. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and casually tossed it onto the hardwood floor right at my feet. "Go get yourself a nice dinner, Imani," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You are going to need the energy to find a new place to live." I stared at the money, then up at her smug face. "Explain this right now," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Calvin stepped forward, puffing out his chest the way he always did when he wanted to assert his authority over his daughters. "We sold the penthouse, Imani. The deal closed 2 days ago. The new owner is sending a moving crew for your belongings tomorrow morning." I actually laughed out loud. The sheer absurdity of his statement echoed off the high ceilings. "You sold my penthouse. You cannot sell a property you do not own." Yolanda smiled, that same patronizing smile she used whenever she thought she had outsmarted me. "Oh, but we did. Do you remember that power of attorney you signed 5 years ago when you needed me to file those trademark papers for your little startup while you were out of the country? You never revoked it. We used it to authorize the sale. $1.2 million straight cash buyout. The paperwork is flawless. The deed has been transferred." The reality of what she was saying hit me like a physical blow. They had kept a legal document from half a decade ago, a document I had signed out of trust, and used it to steal my home. "Why would you do this?" I asked, my voice remarkably steady, despite the hurricane of rage building inside my chest. Brianna rolled her eyes, stepping away from Connor and crossing her arms. "Do not play dumb, Imani. Connor hedge fund took a massive hit last quarter. My lifestyle is not cheap, and the creditors were starting to call our house. We needed liquid cash immediately. You are a single woman. You have no husband, no children. Why do you need 4,000 square feet in Buckhead? It is selfish. You have always been selfish." I stared at my sister, the beautiful, delicate golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life. She felt entirely justified in stealing my home to fund her country club memberships and her white husband failing investments. Connor finally spoke up, a smirk playing on his lips. "It is just real estate, Imani. You can always buy another place. Family comes first, right? We needed the capital, and your parents agreed it was the most logical solution to our liquidity problem. Logical solution. My father, the man who was supposed to protect me, nodded firmly in agreement. You should be grateful we left you $50 for dinner, Calvin said. You are just a homeless person now, Imani. It is time you learned some humility and respected the family hierarchy. Your sister has a marriage to maintain, a family to build. You are just hoarding space and money. It is time you shared your blessings. This was the dynamic I had endured my entire life. When I was 18, working double shifts at a local diner to pay for my college textbooks, my mother had secretly drained my savings account to buy Brianna a brand new luxury car for her high school graduation. I had to take out predatory student loans just to survive my freshman year, while Brianna drove around campus in a vehicle paid for by my sweat. They had always treated me as a resource to be mined, a stepping stone for Brianna's success. I looked at Connor, seeing the smug satisfaction radiating from his privileged face. He thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the loud, ambitious black woman who had built her wealth from scratch. He thought his corporate lawyers and his old money safety net made him untouchable. I looked down at the $50 bill lying on the floor. I looked at my mother, perfectly coiffed, entirely unbothered by the fact that she had just rendered her eldest daughter legally homeless. I looked at my father, proudly defending his blatant theft. And I looked at Brianna, clinging to a man who was using her family to bail out his own catastrophic financial failures. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down, because breaking down was exactly what they expected. They expected the emotional, angry reaction that they could later use to paint me as the unstable, ungrateful daughter. Instead, I stepped right over the $50 bill. I walked over to the marble kitchen island, where the open bottle of vintage champagne sat chilling in an ice bucket. I took a clean crystal flute from the overhead rack, popped the cork, and poured myself a generous glass. The sound of the bubbling liquid was the only noise in the room. I raised the glass to my lips, took a slow, deliberate sip, and let the rich flavor wash over my tongue. Then I looked at the four of them and I smiled. A wide, genuine, completely relaxed smile. The tension in the room instantly shifted. My father's face contorted in confusion and anger. "What is so funny?" Calvin shouted, taking a step toward me. "Have you lost your mind?" I took another sip of champagne, setting the glass down on the counter with a soft clink. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool marble. "What is funny, Dad, is that you did not just steal from your daughter today." I looked directly into Connor's eyes, watching the color slowly drain from his smug face. "The apartment you sold was actually a commercial property owned by my limited liability company, which is heavily backed by a federal tech innovation grant. You did not just forge a deed, you committed federal wire fraud against the United States government. And that eager buyer who gave you quick cash without a traditional inspection." I smiled wider as Brianna gasped. "That buyer is a federal undercover agent from the task force actively investigating Connor hedge fund." The silence that followed was absolute. Yolanda's champagne glass slipped from her trembling hand, shattering violently against the hardwood floor. Before anyone could utter a single word, Connor's cell phone began to ring sharply in his jacket pocket. I swallowed the champagne, letting the crisp bubbles burn the back of my throat. I looked at my father, Calvin, whose face was turning a dangerous shade of red. "You want to know what is so funny, Dad?" I asked, setting the crystal glass back down on the marble counter. "I am laughing because you all actually believe you did something original today. You think this is a master plan. But Yolanda has been stealing from me to fund Brianna since I was 17 years old." Yolanda gasped, pressing a hand to her pearl necklace. Her eyes darted toward Connor, clearly embarrassed that I was airing our dirty laundry in front of her wealthy white son-in-law. "How dare you speak to your mother that way? We provided for you. We gave you everything you needed to succeed in this world." "Provided for me," I repeated, taking a step toward her. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, echoing in the massive open space of my living room. "Do you mean like the time I worked 3 back-to-back night shifts at the downtown diner just to afford my freshman year textbooks at Spelman College?" Do you mean the time I walked into the bank exhausted, smelling like industrial bleach and stale coffee to pay my tuition, and found out my account was overdrawn? You forged my signature, Yolanda. You walked into that branch and drained every single dime I saved, sweeping floors, just so Brianna could drive a brand new Mercedes to her high school prom. Brianna scoffed, playing with her diamond tennis bracelet. She leaned her head against Connor's shoulder, looking entirely bored by my trauma. That was ages ago, Imani. Get over it. I needed a reliable car for college tours, and you were just going to a local school anyway. You never understood how appearances matter in our circles. You were always so perfectly happy settling for less. I ignored my sister and turned my attention squarely to Connor. He stood there adjusting his tailored suit jacket, looking completely unbothered by the fact that his in-laws were serial thieves. In fact, he looked amused. I pointed a finger right at his chest. You think you married into black excellence, Connor? You think you secured a cute little wealthy family to bring to your corporate retreats so you can look diverse and progressive to your board of directors. But you married a family of grifters. They did not just sell my penthouse today to help you out of the goodness of their hearts. They sold it because stealing from me is the only way they know how to survive. They are parasites, and now you are standing right in the mud with them. Connor actually chuckled, a slow, arrogant sound that echoed in my expansive living room. He stepped in front of Brianna, sliding his hands into his pockets. He looked around my home, assessing the custom artwork and the panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline before looking back at me with pure condescension. You are very dramatic, Imani, I will give you that. He smiled a tight, predatory grin. But let us look at the facts here. The deed is transferred. The money is gone. I already moved the entire 1.2 million into an offshore account in the Caymans. It is completely untraceable and fully insulated under my corporate structure. You can yell and scream all you want, but the transaction is final. I stood my ground, refusing to let his corporate intimidation tactics work. You committed fraud, Connor. You used a revoked power of attorney to sell a property you have no legal right to. That is a felony. You really think you can fight me on this? Connor asked, tilting his head. Let us be brutally honest for a second. Look at who you are, and look at who I am. You are a black woman running a cute little startup. I am a white finance executive with a legal team on retainer that costs more than your entire company valuation. My lawyers will spin this as a simple family misunderstanding. They will say you gave your parents verbal permission to sell the place because you were drowning in debt, and now you are having seller remorse. They will paint you as an angry, unstable woman trying to extort her generous family. We will bury you in litigation until you are bankrupt. Who do you think the judge is going to believe, Imani? You or the guy who plays golf with the governor? Take the loss. Calvin nodded firmly, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Connor. Listen to him, Imani. Connor knows how the real world works. You have always been too stubborn for your own good. You never know when to quit. Just take the loss and move on quietly. You can stay in your old bedroom at our house until you get back on your feet. We are not monsters. We take care of our own. The sheer audacity of my father offering me my childhood bedroom after rendering me homeless made my blood run cold. They really thought I was the same terrified 18-year-old girl standing at the bank teller window crying over stolen tuition money. They thought they could bully me into submission using Connor and his old money privilege as a weapon. They expected me to fold under the weight of their combined manipulation. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the angry stereotype they were desperately trying to provoke. Instead, I reached into my designer blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. You are right about one thing, Connor, I said, tapping the screen to unlock it. You do have a lot of privilege, but privilege makes people sloppy. You were so eager to grab $1 million in cash to cover up your failing hedge fund that you did not even bother to check who was actually buying this penthouse. Brianna frowned, looking up at her husband. Connor, what is she talking about? Connor tightened his jaw, visibly irritated that I was not backing down. She is bluffing. She is just trying to scare us. Ignore her, Imani is just throwing a tantrum because she lost. I am not bluffing, Connor. Did you really think my penthouse was just a residential condo? Did you really think a property located right in the middle of the city technology district belonged to me personally? I opened the security application on my phone. My company did not just buy this space for me to sleep in. This property is owned by my limited liability company. And do you know who funds my company, Connor? Do you know who holds the primary stake in our latest urban infrastructure project? I held up my phone showing him a live high-definition feed of the penthouse lobby downstairs. I stepped closer, making sure he could see the screen clearly. You should not have moved that money, Connor. Connor stared at the high-definition feed on my phone screen. Down in the marble lobby of my building, two black SUVs were parked directly outside the glass doors. Four men wearing tactical vests over dress shirts were speaking to the concierge. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered across Connor's face slowly melted away, replaced by a tight, tense line. I pulled my phone back and slipped it into my blazer pocket. You really thought my company bought 4,000 square feet of prime Atlanta real estate just so I could have a nice view of the skyline? I took a step toward him, forcing him to look me in the eye. This property is zoned commercial, Connor. It is the registered headquarters of my tech firm, and my firm is currently operating on a massive federal grant from the Department of Urban Development to build smart city infrastructure grids. My father Calvin let out a harsh, dismissive breath, waving his hand. Stop trying to confuse the issue with technicalities, Imani. Commercial or residential, it does not matter. We had the power of attorney. We sold the asset. If there is a zoning issue, your mother and I can just pay a small fine and sort out the paperwork on Monday. I turned to my father, marveling at how a man who had spent his entire life working as a church treasurer could be so profoundly ignorant about the law. There is no fine, Dad. When you and Mom used a revoked document to authorize the sale of a federally backed commercial asset, you committed fraud against the United States government. And when Connor moved that $1.2 million across international borders to his Cayman account, he elevated a localized family theft into federal wire fraud and money laundering. Yolanda gripped the edge of the kitchen island. Her knuckles turned white. Imani, stop this nonsense right now. You are trying to scare your sister, and it is not going to work. We sold the place to a perfectly nice private cash buyer, a man named Julian Pierce. He was a gentleman. He even complimented my pearls when we signed the closing documents. I could not help it. I laughed again. Julian Pierce is not a private real estate investor, Mom. Julian Pierce is a senior undercover agent for the federal task force. They have been investigating Connor hedge fund for the past 14 months. The color completely drained from Connor's face. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the custom velvet sofa. Brianna grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Connor, tell her she is lying, Brianna demanded, her voice climbing to a shrill, panicked pitch. Tell her she is just making this up because she is jealous of us. I kept my eyes locked on my brother-in-law. His firm has been bleeding institutional money for over a year, Brianna. He has been running a glorified Ponzi scheme, shifting assets from new investors to pay off the old ones to maintain the illusion of profitability. The feds knew it, but they needed a solid predicate act of financial fraud to trigger a federal racketeering charge. They needed him to move dirty money across borders. They just needed the bait. I took another step forward, closing the distance between me and the golden couple. And then my greedy parents walked right into a federal sting operation and handed Connor a stolen $1.2 million commercial deed. You gave the federal government the exact bullet they needed to put a bullet in his entire operation. The crystal champagne flute slipped from Yolanda's hand. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash, sending shards of glass and expensive vintage champagne flying across the room. My mother stared at the broken mess, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. The reality of her actions was finally breaching the wall of her staggering entitlement. Brianna let out a blood-curdling scream. You are lying, she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at my face. You are just a bitter, lonely woman who wants to ruin my marriage. You have always been jealous of me, Imani. You were jealous when Mom bought me that car, and you are jealous now because I married a wealthy man while you spend every night alone with your laptop. You set us up. I stood perfectly still, letting her tantrum echo through the high ceilings of the penthouse. I am not jealous of a woman who has to steal from her sister to buy designer handbags, Brianna. And I certainly did not set you up. You and Dad made the conscious choice to break into my home and forge my signature. Just like you made the conscious choice to steal my identity when we were in college to open up a credit card so you could go on a spring break trip to Cabo. Dad paid off that debt to keep you out of jail and blamed me for being careless with my mail. He protected you then. Let us see if he can protect you from the Department of Justice. Calvin stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked like he wanted to strike me, but he was too paralyzed by the mention of the federal government. Imani, you need to call this off. You need to call whoever is down in that lobby and tell them this was a family arrangement. We are your blood. You do not send your own blood to prison over money. I did not send you anywhere, Dad. You bought the ticket yourself. Before Calvin could fire back another excuse, a sharp, piercing ringtone cut through the heavy tension in the room. It was coming from Connor's jacket pocket. Connor flinched as if the sound had physically burned him. He pulled the phone out with trembling hands. The caller ID glowed brightly in the dimming afternoon light. It was his firm head compliance officer, a man who never called on a weekend unless the building was literally on fire. Answer it, Connor. I instructed, my voice calm and completely void of sympathy. Tell them how you solved your liquidity problem. Connor swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. He did not say hello. He just stood there, listening. The silence in the penthouse was suffocating. Yolanda stopped breathing. Brianna clutched her own chest, watching her husband's face transform from arrogant superiority to absolute naked terror. No, Connor whispered into the phone, his voice cracking. No, that is impossible. You need to call the legal department right now. Tell them it was a personal transaction. It had nothing to do with the firm assets. He listened for another 10 seconds before his knees buckled. He dropped heavily onto my velvet sofa, staring blankly at the floor. The phone slipped from his hand and tumbled onto the rug. The call had ended. Brianna dropped to her knees beside him, shaking his shoulders. Connor, what is it? What did they say? Connor looked up at my sister, his eyes completely hollow. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The SEC, he choked out. The Securities and Exchange Commission just raided the corporate office in Midtown. They froze everything. The corporate accounts, the offshore holdings, my personal trusts. It is all gone, Brianna. They froze it all. Connor stared at his phone lying on my expensive Persian rug. For a few seconds, the entire penthouse was dead silent. The reality of the Securities and Exchange Commission raiding his Midtown office and freezing his corporate accounts hung in the air like a thick, suffocating cloud. I watched his chest heave as his brain struggled to process the destruction of his precious financial empire. But men like Connor were never taught how to lose. They were conditioned from birth to believe that the world was their personal playground and that any obstacle could simply be crushed under the weight of their generational wealth and corporate lawyers. I saw the exact moment his shock curdled into venomous rage. He bent down and snatched his phone off the rug. He did not look like a defeated man. He looked like a cornered predator ready to strike. He straightened his spine, adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, and glared at me with a level of pure hatred that would have terrified me 10 years ago. But today, it only fueled my satisfaction. You think you are so smart, Imani? Connor sneered, his voice dropping to a low, menacing gravel. You think you just executed some brilliant masterstroke by tricking my in-laws into selling a federally backed property. But you have zero idea who you are dealing with. My firm has legal counsel that costs more per hour than your entire startup generates in a fiscal quarter. You are a small-time entrepreneur playing in a league you do not even begin to understand. Do you honestly believe the federal government is going to side with an angry, vindictive black woman over a recognized financial institution? We are going to bury you. I leaned back against the marble kitchen island, crossing my arms. Bury me for what, Connor? For standing in my own living room while you voluntarily confessed to moving stolen money across international borders. Connor laughed, a harsh barking sound that held absolutely no humor. There was no stolen money. There was a family dispute over a shared asset. That is exactly how my lawyers are going to frame this. We are going to claim entrapment. We will tell the judge that you orchestrated this entire situation because you were jealous of my marriage to your sister. We will say you intentionally provided your parents with confusing documentation, knowing they would make a mistake, and then you maliciously funneled the transaction to an undercover federal agent just to sabotage a legitimate business. By the time my legal team is done drafting the narrative, you will be the one facing federal charges for orchestrating a fraudulent sting operation against a private citizen. He turned his back to me and looked directly at my father. Calvin stood near the shattered remains of the champagne glass, looking pale but attentive. Connor pointed a firm, commanding finger at my father, treating him like a subordinate employee rather than his father-in-law. "Calvin, you are going to listen to me very carefully," Connor ordered. "When the investigators come knocking, and they will come knocking, you are going to tell them that Imani gave you explicit verbal authorization to sell this penthouse. You are going to tell them that during Sunday dinner 3 weeks ago, she cried to you about being drowning in corporate debt and begged you to handle the sale because she was too stressed to manage the paperwork herself. You will say she handed you the power of attorney specifically for this purpose." Yolanda stepped forward, her eyes wide with desperate complicity. "Yes, that is right. We were just trying to help our struggling daughter. We had no idea the buyer was a federal agent. She tricked us, Connor. She set us up because she hates seeing Brianna happy." Connor nodded sharply, pointing at my mother in agreement. "Exactly, Yolanda. You stick to that story. We present a united front. The wealthy, successful sister and the loving parents victimized by the unstable, jealous sibling. We will have sworn affidavits drafted by midnight. It will be our word against hers, and we outnumber her 3-1. I watched this criminal conspiracy unfold right in my own kitchen. They were literally coordinating perjury and obstruction of justice in front of my face, completely blind to their own hubris. They genuinely believed that their collective lies could override a mountain of federal evidence simply because they wanted it to be true. "You are going to commit perjury, Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. "You are going to sit in front of a federal judge, place your hand on a Bible, and swear to a fabricated story just to save a white man who looks at you like you are the help?" Calvin squared his shoulders, jutting his chin out in that stubborn, defensive way he always did when he knew he was wrong, but refused to admit it. "I am doing what is necessary for this family, Imani. You brought this entirely on yourself. If you had just been reasonable and shared your resources with your sister, we would not be in this mess. I am the head of this family, and my job is to protect our legacy. If that means I have to correct your narrative to keep Brianna's husband out of a misunderstanding, then that is exactly what I will do. You should have thought about the consequences before you tried to destroy your own blood." I slowly shook my head, letting out a dry, bitter chuckle. "You have always been willing to throw me to the wolves to save her dad. Always. You think I am surprised that you are willing to lie to the federal government today? You gave me the exact same speech on a rainy night back in 2010. Do you remember that, Dad? Do you remember the night Brianna took your vintage Mustang out for a joyride without a license?" Brianna flinched, taking a quick step backward. Her perfectly manicured hands fluttered nervously to her throat. "Imani, shut up," she hissed, glancing frantically at Connor. "No, let us talk about your protective instincts, Dad." I continued, my voice rising with righteous clarity. "Brianna was 17 years old. She got drunk at a high school party and crashed your prized car straight into a neighborhood retaining wall. I was at home asleep in my bed studying for my final exams. You woke me up at 2 in the morning, dragged me out to the crash site in the pouring rain, and forced me to sit behind the steering wheel before the police arrived." Yolanda waved her hands frantically, as if she could physically bat my words out of the air. "That is ancient history, Imani. Stop living in the past." "It is relevant history, Mom," I snapped, refusing to break eye contact with my father. "You told the police I was the one driving Dad. You told them I took the car without permission. You stood right there in the rain and lied to the officers while Brianna hid crying in the bushes. You told me I had to take the fall because Brianna had just secured a full-ride cheerleading scholarship to her university, and a criminal record would ruin her bright future. You said my future was not as fragile because I was just going to the local community college anyway. I got a suspended license. I had to pay thousands of dollars in court fees and increased insurance premiums from my diner tips. You let me carry a criminal mark on my record to keep Brianna's slate perfectly clean. You have been covering her crimes since high school, Dad." Calvin did not even look ashamed. He looked defiant. "I made a command decision to protect the child who had the most to lose. Brianna had a fragile trajectory. You have always been tough, Imani. You bounced back from everything. You handled the fines and you turned out fine. I protected my family, and I am protecting my family right now. Connor is right. We will testify that you authorized the sale. The feds will see this as a messy domestic dispute and drop the charges. Brianna pulled her phone out, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. She tapped the screen frantically, trying to open her banking application. Connor. She whimpered, her voice cracking. Connor. My black card is declining. The app says my accounts are locked. I cannot even access the joint checking. Connor rubbed his temples aggressively. I told you, Brianna, the SEC froze everything. It is standard procedure during a corporate raid. We just need to weather the storm until my lawyers file an emergency injunction on Monday morning. We just need to stick to the script. You really think this is a local precinct, Dad? I asked, my voice slicing through their pathetic delusions. You think the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice operate like those small-town cops you sweet-talked a decade ago? You think they are going to listen to your little family drama narrative and just walk away from a multi-million-dollar wire fraud investigation? You think they do not already have the entire paper trail? I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out my phone. I did not care about Connor threats. I did not care about my father promises to commit perjury. I was entirely done letting them believe they had any control over this situation or my life. I unlocked my screen and dialed my business partner, Malik. The phone rang exactly once before Malik answered. His voice came through the speaker loud and crystal clear, echoing in the silent tension of the penthouse. I am here, Imani, Malik said, his tone sharp and strictly professional. Malik, I said, staring directly at the arrogant white man who thought he could steal my home and the toxic family who helped him do it. Hit the switch. The line clicked and a third voice joined the call. It was a man with a crisp, authoritative tone that carried no warmth and no room for negotiation. This is Special Agent Hayes with the Financial Crimes Task Force. Am I speaking with Imani? Yes, Agent Hayes, I replied, keeping the phone held high so the speaker projected his voice into every corner of the room. You are on speakerphone. My family and my brother-in-law Connor are present. I believe you have an update regarding the wire transfer tied to the fraudulent deed of sale. Connor lunged forward, his hand outstretched to grab my phone. Shut that off right now, Imani. You are violating my rights. I sidestepped him smoothly, and my father Calvin actually stepped between us. Not to protect me, but because the mention of a federal agent had finally pierced through his thick skull. Calvin held his hands up, staring at the phone. Let the man speak, Connor. If we have nothing to hide, let him speak. Agent Hayes did not miss a beat. We successfully tracked the $1.2 million released during the sting operation this morning. The funds were routed through a domestic holding account, but they did not remain there. Exactly 42 minutes ago, the entire sum was wired internationally. The money bypassed all joint accounts associated with Connor and Brianna. It was deposited directly into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. The air in the room grew heavy. Brianna stopped crying and stared at the phone, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure confusion. Wait, she said, her voice shaking. That is not right. Connor told me the money was going straight to the creditors to pay off the lien on our house in Alpharetta. Agent Hayes continued, his voice clinical and completely devoid of pity. The offshore account is solely controlled by Connor. There are no secondary signatories. Furthermore, we have intercepted internal communications indicating this transfer was designed as a flight fund. Connor was actively liquidating assets to flee the jurisdiction before the impending SEC indictments were unsealed on Monday morning. I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my pocket. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. It was the sound of a carefully constructed illusion shattering into a million jagged pieces. Brianna turned slowly to look at her husband, the man she had paraded around every family function for the past 4 years. The man my parents treated like a god, simply because he wore expensive suits and came from a wealthy white family. Connor's face was pale and slick with a thin layer of sweat. His eyes darted around the room looking for an exit that did not exist. Connor. Brianna whispered, her voice trembling so violently it barely sounded human. You were going to leave me. Connor backed away from her, holding his hands up defensively. Brianna, you do not understand. The firm was collapsing. The feds were going to seize everything anyway. If I paid your stupid credit card bills, the money would just be tied up in litigation. I needed a safety net. I was going to send for you once the dust settled. You are lying! Brianna screamed, the sound ripping from her throat with a feral intensity. You were going to leave me here to take the fall. You made me forge my own sister's signature. You told me it was the only way to save our marriage and keep our house. And you were just packing your bags to run to the Caribbean. The pristine, perfect couple shattered right in front of me. Brianna lunged at him, her perfectly manicured hands curling into fists as she shoved him hard in the chest. Connor stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the rug. He caught his balance and shoved her back violently. All the polished old money charm evaporated in an instant, revealing the cowardly, desperate man underneath. "Do not touch me," Connor snarled, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "You think I am the villain here? You drained my liquid assets dry for 3 years, Brianna. You and your endless shopping sprees, your luxury vacations, your desperate need to look rich for your little friends. You bled me dry while the market turned against me. I had to start shifting client funds just to keep up with your lifestyle. You are a liability. I was taking that money because it was the only way I was going to survive the mess you helped create." Calvin stepped forward, his face purple with rage. He grabbed Connor by the shoulders, spinning him around. "Do not you dare speak to my daughter that way. We put our necks on the line for you. We risked everything to help you secure that money because you said you were going to take care of her." Connor slapped Calvin hand away with a look of pure disgust. The racial and class dynamics they had all politely ignored for years suddenly flared up in the most vicious way possible. Connor looked at my father not as a respected elder, but as a useful idiot he had successfully discarded. "Take care of her." Connor laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "I gave your daughter a lifestyle you could never afford to give her, Calvin. I elevated this entire family. And what did you do? You handed me a stolen deed on a silver platter. You were so desperate to keep your golden child in a mansion that you did not even ask questions. You are a pathetic old fool who thought playing nice with the wealthy white guy would secure your legacy. You did this to yourselves." Yolanda let out a choked sob, pressing her hands to her mouth. She backed away from Connor, looking at him as if he had just grown horns. The man she had worshipped, the son-in-law she had constantly compared me to, was standing in my living room calling her husband a fool and treating her daughter like trash. Brianna fell to her knees on the hardwood floor, sobbing hysterically. She rocked back and forth, clutching her stomach, the reality of her ruined life finally crashing down on her. Her marriage was a sham. Her wealth was a lie. She was facing federal charges for a man who was actively packing his bags to abandon her. I watched them tear each other apart, tearing their toxic family dynamic to shreds. They had spent my entire life telling me I was the problem. They had spent my entire life insisting that if I just fell in line and supported Brianna, everything would be fine. But the truth was, they were a house of cards built on lies, greed, and willful ignorance. And I was the wind that finally blew them down. Before Calvin could throw a punch at Connor, before Yolanda could drop to the floor to comfort her sobbing golden child, a sound echoed through the penthouse that made everyone freeze. It was a heavy, authoritative knock on my custom mahogany double doors. It was not a polite knock. It was the sound of a fist hammering against solid wood, demanding immediate entry. The arguing stopped instantly. Connor went completely rigid, his eyes locked on the front entrance. Brianna stopped crying and scrambled to her feet, hiding behind Yolanda. Calvin swallowed hard, his hands dropping to his sides. I did not move to open the door. I just stood there watching the color drain from my family faces. I knew exactly who was on the other side. The heavy doors were pushed open from the outside. The concierge had granted them access, and they did not need an invitation to step inside. 2 large, imposing men wearing tactical vests over their dress shirts walked into my foyer. The gold badges on their belts caught the afternoon light. They were armed, focused, and completely unsympathetic to the domestic drama unfolding in my living room. "Federal Marshals, the first man," announced, his voice booming across the open floor plan. He did not ask questions. He issued commands. "This property has just been designated as an active federal crime scene and a seized asset in an ongoing financial fraud investigation. Everyone in this room needs to step away from the furniture and place their hands where we can see them. Yolanda let out a terrified squeak, raising her trembling hands in the air. Calvin stepped back, his proud chest caving in, as the reality of federal law enforcement standing in his daughter's home finally broke him. Connor looked like he was about to pass out. He stared at the marshals, his mouth hanging open, unable to formulate a single coherent lie. "We have a court order mandating the immediate evacuation of these premises," the second marshal stated, pulling a folded document from his vest and dropping it onto my kitchen island. "No one is permitted to remove any items from this location. You will leave your bags. You will leave your coats. You will leave your phones if they are currently resting on any surface. You will exit the building immediately, and you will not return." Brianna looked at her designer handbag sitting on the sofa. "But my car keys are in there," she cried, her voice thin and desperate. "How are we supposed to get home?" The marshal stared at her with a cold, hard gaze. "That is not my problem, Mom. Step away from the bag and move toward the elevator. Now." They were herded like cattle. Yolanda was crying silently, tears ruining her expensive makeup. Calvin kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the men in tactical gear, thoroughly stripped of his arrogant patriarchal authority. Connor walked like a zombie, his eyes vacant, his mind clearly calculating how many years he was going to spend in a federal penitentiary. Brianna followed close behind him, sobbing openly, her golden life reduced to ash in a matter of minutes. I stood tall, my hands resting comfortably at my sides. I was compliant, but I was victorious. The marshals nodded at me, gesturing toward the door. I did not argue. I did not complain. I walked out of my own penthouse, leaving behind the shattered remains of my mother's champagne glass and the shattered remains of the family that had tried to destroy me. I stepped onto the private elevator, right behind the people who had called me a homeless person just an hour ago. The doors slid shut, sealing our fates and plunging us into the cold, hard reality of the consequences they had brought upon themselves. 1 week passed since the federal marshals escorted my family out of my penthouse. 7 days of absolute silence from my parents, which I knew was entirely strategic. They were not reflecting on their crimes. They were regrouping. They were building a narrative. In our community, there is no stage more powerful than a Sunday dinner after morning service. It is the ultimate courtroom where reputations are cemented or destroyed over plates of collard greens and macaroni and cheese. Calvin and Yolanda knew they could not beat me in a federal court, so they decided to try and destroy me in the court of public opinion. I drove my new sports car up the winding driveway of the massive suburban estate. This was the exact house Calvin had blackmailed me with. The house they secured by secretly using my social security number a decade ago, when my credit was spotless, and theirs was ruined by Calvin and his failed business ventures. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles and the familiar white passenger van belonging to Greater Hope Fellowship. They had brought out the heavy artillery. They invited the church elders, the gossiping aunts, the judgmental uncles, and Pastor Jenkins himself. I parked my car right behind the van belonging to Pastor Jenkins. I did not wear a casual Sunday dress. I wore a bespoke tailored emerald green suit with sharp shoulders and a crisp white silk blouse. I wore my hair pulled back, sleek and severe. I looked exactly like the corporate powerhouse they were trying to convince everyone I was not. I looked untouchable and completely unbothered by the incoming storm. I walked up the brick steps and opened the heavy oak front door. I still had my key from years ago. The entryway smelled of fried chicken, sweet potato pie, and deep desperation. I did not announce my arrival. I walked softly down the long hallway leading to the formal dining room. The house was filled with the loud, booming voices of my extended family, but the voice belonging to Calvin rose above the rest. He was holding court at the head of the long mahogany table. I stopped just outside the dining room archway, letting the shadows conceal me while I listened to the fairy tale my father was spinning for his eager audience. Calvin was speaking to Pastor Jenkins using his most pious and humble voice. "We just do not know what has gotten into Imani." Pastor Calvin sighed heavily. "We sent her to good schools. We raised her right here in the church. But that tech money changed her fundamentally. She has become so bitter and jealous of her sister." You know Brianna is married to a wonderful, successful white man, and they are building a beautiful interracial family. Imani just cannot stand to see her younger sister living the fairy tale life while she sits alone in an empty apartment counting her money. Aunt Beatrice chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. It is a shame, Calvin. It is a real shame. A black woman making good money should be lifting her family up, not tearing them down. What exactly did she do to poor Brianna? Yolanda picked up the script seamlessly. She lied to the authorities, Beatrice. Yolanda sounded like she was on the verge of tears. She had a mental breakdown over some massive business debts and begged us to help her sell her property to cover the losses. When Connor stepped in to help leverage the sale using his elite financial connections, she panicked. She called the police and claimed we stole from her. She is trying to ruin the career Connor built out of pure spite, just because no man wants to marry a woman with her aggressive masculine attitude. She is unstable. We are just praying she drops these ridiculous federal charges before she destroys her own blood and ruins her own soul. Pastor Jenkins murmured a deep, resonant prayer, asking for my soul to be cleansed of jealousy and wrath. He told my parents they were carrying a heavy cross, but God would reward their infinite patience. They were nodding along, soaking up the sympathy, painting themselves as the loving, long-suffering parents of a vindictive spinster. They were setting the stage to isolate me from the entire community, so I would have no choice but to drop the federal charges against Connor and Calvin. They wanted the church to shame me into submission. I adjusted my blazer cuffs and stepped out of the shadows. I walked directly into the center of the archway, where the light from the crystal chandelier caught the emerald fabric of my suit. The dining room went dead silent. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on a television set. Aunt Beatrice froze with a fork halfway to her mouth. A piece of candied yam dropped onto her plate. Pastor Jenkins stopped mid-prayer, his eyes wide. Calvin lost all the color in his face, turning a sickly shade of gray. Brianna, who had been sitting next to Connor looking like a fragile, wounded bird, suddenly shrank back into her heavy wooden chair. Connor refused to look at me, staring intensely at his half-eaten plate of food. I did not look angry. I did not look unstable. I looked directly at the pastor and offered a polite, measured smile. "Good afternoon, Pastor Jenkins," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the long, silent room. "I hope the sermon today was about bearing false witness. It seems my parents might need a severe refresher on the 9th commandment." The room erupted into shocked gasps. No one spoke to Calvin and Yolanda like that in their own home, especially not in front of the church leadership. Aunt Beatrice dropped her fork onto her porcelain plate with a loud clatter. "Imani, how dare you disrupt a Sunday dinner with this blatant disrespect," she scolded. "Your parents are heartbroken over your destructive behavior." I did not even look at Beatrice. My eyes remained locked on my mother. Yolanda realized her entire narrative was in sudden jeopardy, so she escalated the situation the only way she knew how. She threw herself into a theatrical display of maternal agony. She practically leaped out of her upholstered chair and threw her arms around the shoulder belonging to Pastor Jenkins, burying her face in his dark suit jacket. "Pastor, protect us!" Yolanda wailed, sobbing loudly enough to shake the walls. "She has lost her mind. She is a Jezebel sent to destroy this righteous family. She is trying to put her own father in a federal prison out of pure spite. She wants to see us out on the streets. Please pray for her, Pastor. Pray the demons of greed and jealousy out of her before she kills us all with her endless cruelty." Pastor Jenkins looked incredibly uncomfortable, but he placed a comforting hand on the back belonging to Yolanda. "Now, Imani," he started using his deep preaching voice. "We are all family here under God. The Lord teaches us forgiveness and grace. Whatever financial disagreements you have with your father and brother-in-law should not be handled by the government. You need to drop this terrible vendetta and come back to the Lord. You are hurting your dear mother." Brianna started crying on cue, wiping away invisible tears. "We just want our sister back, Imani," Brianna sobbed. "Please stop trying to ruin my marriage. Connor did nothing but try to help you out of your debt." I stood perfectly still, watching the circus perform their rehearsed routine. They were hitting every mark perfectly. The grieving mother, the protective father, the victimized sister, and the holy mediator. They thought they had cornered me. They thought bringing the entire church leadership into their dining room would shame me into submission. They thought my desire to maintain a respectable image in the Black community would outweigh my desire for absolute justice. They were completely wrong. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against the Jezebel accusations. I did not explain my penthouse or the fraud. I simply raised my right hand in the air, snapping my fingers once. Footsteps echoed down the hardwood hallway behind me. Sharp, confident clicks of expensive designer heels. A woman stepped through the archway, coming to stand directly at my right shoulder. It was Sasha, my powerhouse corporate attorney. She was wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a completely ruthless expression. She looked at the crowded dining table the way a hawk looks at a field of helpless mice. And in her arms, Sasha carried a heavy stack of thick manila folders. Everyone at the table stared at the newcomer in total confusion. Yolanda stopped fake crying on the shoulder of Pastor Jenkins, peering at Sasha with wide, panicked eyes. Calvin gripped the edges of the dining table, his knuckles turning stark white. "Pastor Jenkins," I said, keeping my voice perfectly pleasant and completely lethal. "You mentioned that financial disagreements should not be handled by the government. But what about when those financial disagreements involve the Community Building Fund of Greater Hope Fellowship?" Pastor Jenkins frowned, his hands dropping away from Yolanda. "What are you talking about, Imani?" I stepped fully into the room, signaling for Sasha to follow me toward the table. "I am talking about the truth, Pastor. I am talking about why my parents are so desperate to paint me as an unstable villain today. They need you to think I am a liar, because if you believe me, you might actually look at the accounting ledgers Calvin has been managing for the past 7 years. I think it is time we stop talking about my penthouse and start talking about the church bank accounts." Sasha did not say a single word. She did not need to. She simply walked around the long mahogany dining table, her heels striking the floor with rhythmic precision. She stopped behind Pastor Jenkins and placed a thick manila folder right on top of his pristine linen placemat. She moved to Aunt Beatrice, dropping another folder next to her untouched candied yams. She handed one to Uncle David, then another to the head of the church deacon board, who was sitting near the window. Finally, Sasha walked over to where my father sat frozen at the head of the table and slapped the thickest folder down directly over his dinner plate. Calvin stared at the manila envelope as if it were a live grenade. A bead of sweat formed at his temple and slowly rolled down the side of his face. He reached out with a trembling hand, trying to pull the folder away from Pastor Jenkins. "Now wait just a minute." Calvin stammered, his booming patriarch voice completely gone, replaced by a thin, desperate squeak. "Pastor, you do not need to look at whatever fabricated nonsense my daughter printed out. This is a private family matter. She is just trying to embarrass us because she is angry about a real estate transaction. Please hand that back to me." Pastor Jenkins ignored my father entirely. The older man possessed a quiet, commanding authority, and he was not accustomed to being told what to do by his treasurer. He opened the folder. The room was so silent you could hear the crisp sound of the paper turning. Aunt Beatrice and Uncle David opened their folders too. For a long, terrible minute, the only sound in the suburban dining room was the collective breathing of my extended family as they read through the meticulously highlighted financial records Sasha and I had compiled over the past week. I stood at the archway, watching the exact moment the realization hit them. It was beautiful. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a woman who held all the cards. "Page 1, Pastor Jenkins," I said, letting my words hang in the heavy air. "Look at the date. June 14th of last year. You will see a wire transfer of $85,000 moving out of the Greater Hope Fellowship Community Building Fund, the fund you entrusted to my father. Now look at page 2. That exact same day, a deposit of $85,000 was made into the joint checking account belonging to Brianna and Connor." Pastor Jenkins gripped the edges of the paper. His dark brown eyes slowly lifted from the page and locked onto Calvin. His face, previously a mask of pastoral concern, was turning a deep, dangerous shade of red. "That cannot be right." Aunt Beatrice whispered, her hands shaking, as she flipped to the third page of her own folder. "Calvin, what is this? It says here that $40,000 was withdrawn from the Church Youth Center renovation account in November." She looked up, glaring across the table at Brianna. "That was the exact same month you and Connor went on that luxury 2-week vacation to the Maldives." You posted pictures on a private yacht while the roof of the church youth center was leaking. Brianna shrank back into her chair, shaking her head frantically. I did not know, she cried out, her voice high and defensive. I swear I did not know where the money came from. Connor told me his hedge fund had a great quarter. He said it was a bonus. Connor slammed his hand flat on the table, causing the silverware to jump. Do not you dare try to pin this on me, Brianna, he snarled, turning on his wife with vicious speed. You knew exactly how much debt you were in. You knew my fund was restricted. Your father offered to float us a loan to keep up appearances, and you took it without asking a single question about where a retired church treasurer suddenly got $100,000 in liquid cash. I stepped closer to the table, my eyes fixed on my mother. Yolanda was gripping the edge of her chair, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. You see, Aunt Beatrice, I said, maintaining my calm executioner tone. My parents have always been obsessed with appearances. They needed everyone in this room to believe that Brianna had secured a massive fortune by marrying a white finance executive. But Connor is not a billionaire. He is a fraud who lost his clients' money and has been drowning in corporate debt for years. My parents could not handle the embarrassment of their golden child downgrading her lifestyle. So my father decided to play God with the congregation tithes. Calvin shot out of his chair, pointing a trembling finger at me. You are twisting the facts, Imani. I was investing the church money. Connor promised me a guaranteed 30% return on those funds. I was trying to double the building fund for the congregation. It was a bridge loan to his hedge fund. He promised me he would put the money back before the annual audit. Pastor Jenkins stood up. He was a tall, imposing man, and the sheer weight of his disappointment seemed to crush the air out of the room. A bridge loan. Calvin the pastor asked, his voice low and trembling with absolute fury. You took the money given by single mothers, by elderly widows, on fixed incomes, by people who trusted you with their salvation, and you handed it to this man to fund a lavish lifestyle. You stole from God, Calvin. You brought a thief into my sanctuary. It was not just for Connor, Pastor. I intervened, ensuring Calvin did not get a chance to deflect the blame entirely onto his son-in-law. Look at page 5. You will see a series of smaller withdrawals over the past 3 years. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. Those did not go into Connor hedge fund. Those went directly to my mother personal credit cards. Yolanda gasped, bringing her hands up to cover her face. I pointed directly at her. That beautiful pearl necklace you are wearing right now, Mom. The one you wore to church this morning so everyone could tell you how blessed you look. Do you think God blessed you with that? Or did the Sunday offering plate pay for it? You called me a Jezebel 5 minutes ago. You sat there and cried on the shoulder of your pastor, playing the victim while wearing stolen property around your neck. Aunt Beatrice stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She was a formidable woman who had dedicated her entire life to the church, and her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. I gave my pension to that build. Calvin, she shouted, slamming her hand against the folder. I ate rice and beans for a month so those kids could have a safe place to play after school. And you took my money to buy your spoiled, ungrateful daughter a designer handbag. You are a disgrace to this family. You are a disgrace to our community. Uncle David joined in, shouting across the table. We vouched for you, Calvin. We trusted you. How could you look us in the eye every Sunday knowing you were robbing us blind? The dining room erupted into absolute chaos. The carefully constructed social facade my parents had spent decades building shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. The aunts were yelling, the uncles were demanding answers, and Pastor Jenkins stood at the head of the table looking at my father with a mixture of disgust and profound sorrow. Calvin was sweating profusely, stammering out pathetic excuses that no one was listening to. He tried to blame Connor. Connor shouted back, threatening to sue Calvin for defamation. Brianna sat frozen between them, looking wildly around the room as the wealthy, untouchable image she had curated for years was ripped away, revealing the pathetic reality underneath. They had spent my entire life convincing the extended family that I was the difficult child, the stubborn outcast, who could not appreciate her wonderful, loving parents. They had marginalized me at every family reunion, every holiday, every birthday party. Now the truth was laid bare on the dining room table in black and white ink. I did not have to scream. I did not have to cry. I just stood there with Sasha by my side watching the ultimate execution of their social standing. Yolanda looked at me through her panicked tears. Her eyes begged me to stop to somehow fix the devastating damage I had just unleashed. But there was no mercy left in me. They had sold my home while I was on vacation. They had tried to destroy my business. They had laughed in my face and told me to take the loss. The entire room turned on my parents and my sister. The shouting grew louder, the accusations flying across the table like daggers. The social execution was absolute. They were trapped in their own dining room with nowhere to run, and Brianna knew it. The golden child looked around at the furious faces of her relatives and realized her parents could no longer protect her. She realized Connor was not going to save her. She needed a distraction, and she needed one immediately. The shouting in the dining room reached a deafening crescendo. Aunt Beatrice was no longer just crying over her stolen pension. She was demanding that Uncle David block the front door so Calvin could not leave. She demanded that the deacon board immediately seize the church bank accounts and confiscate my father's keys to the fellowship hall. Pastor Jenkins stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of righteous fury, nodding in agreement. My father, the man who had ruled our family with an iron fist for 3 decades, was shrinking into his expensive leather dining chair. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. Yolanda was shaking her head violently, muttering incoherent prayers, trying to grab the sleeve of Pastor Jenkins' jacket. He physically stepped out of her reach, pulling his arm away as if her touch would burn him. The absolute rejection from the spiritual leader of our community was the final blow to my mother's social standing. I stood next to Sasha, watching the empire crumble. This was the exact environment Brianna had thrived in her entire life. She was the golden child, the delicate flower who always needed to be protected from the harsh realities of the world. But right now, the world was inside her dining room, and there was nowhere left to hide. Brianna looked wildly around the room. She looked at her father, who was staring blankly at the scattered financial documents. She looked at her mother, who was weeping on the floor. Finally, she looked at Connor. Her wealthy white husband, the man who was supposed to be her ultimate shield, was actively inching his way toward the hallway. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, undoubtedly trying to contact his criminal defense attorneys. I was preparing to abandon her. Brianna realized in that split second that the money was gone, the social status was destroyed, and her marriage was collapsing in real time. She knew she could not argue against bank statements. She could not bat her eyelashes and sweet-talk her way out of grand larceny. She needed to shut down the interrogation immediately. She needed to flip the narrative and force everyone in the room to stop looking at her like a thief and start looking at her like a victim. She needed the ultimate distraction. I saw the shift in her eyes before anyone else did. I had spent 33 years watching Brianna manipulate our parents to get out of trouble. I knew her tells. I watched her take a deep, shaky breath and close her eyes tightly. She grabbed the edge of the heavy mahogany dining table with both hands. Her knuckles turned stark white. She let out a sharp sound of distress. Brianna swayed on her feet. She let out a high-pitched, agonizing wail and swept her right arm across the table. She intentionally struck 3 heavy crystal water goblets. They flew off the edge and shattered violently against the hardwood floor, sending shards of glass and ice water splashing everywhere. Brianna dropped to her knees right into the puddle of water and broken glass. She curled into a tight fetal position, wrapping both arms protectively around her flat stomach. "My baby," Brianna screamed, the sound ripping from her throat with a feral, terrifying intensity. The stress, I cannot breathe, she is hurting my baby. The performance was absolute perfection. It was an Oscar-worthy display of maternal agony. She rocked back and forth on the floor, sobbing hysterically, burying her face in her hands. The room, which had just been a tribunal of justice, instantly transformed into a chaotic medical emergency. The fury of the church elders evaporated, replaced by sheer human panic. Aunt Beatrice let out a terrified shriek and rushed to the other side of the table, dropping to her knees next to my sister. "Brianna, honey, breathe. Somebody call an ambulance right now." Uncle David pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. Pastor Jenkins closed his eyes and immediately started praying out loud, casting out spirits of death and demanding God protect the unborn child. Yolanda snapped out of her financial despair and instantly reverted to her primary biological function, protecting the golden child at all costs. She shoved past the deacon board and threw herself onto the floor, wrapping her arms around Brianna. My grandbaby Yolanda wailed, glaring up at the ceiling. "Hold on, Brianna. Mommy is here." I stood perfectly still, watching the theatrics unfold. Sasha leaned slightly toward me, her eyes fixed on my sister writhing on the floor. "Is she actually pregnant?" Sasha asked, her voice dropping to a cool professional whisper. I did not take my eyes off Brianna. I shook my head slowly. "No, she is not. But she knows a medical crisis is the only way out of this room without wearing handcuffs." Connor, who had been practically halfway out the front door, suddenly froze. For a man facing federal racketeering charges and a completely frozen offshore bank account, an emergency involving his pregnant wife was the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. It was the perfect smokescreen to escape a house full of furious people ready to lynch him for stealing their church funds. Connor bolted back into the dining room, shoving Uncle David out of the way. He dropped to his knees and scooped Brianna up into his arms, lifting her bridal style off the wet glass-covered floor. Brianna buried her face in his neck, sobbing loudly and clutching her stomach as if she were actively going into labor. "Move," Connor shouted, kicking a shattered goblet out of his path. "We do not have time to wait for an ambulance. I am driving her to the emergency room right now. Everyone get out of my way." The aunts and uncles scrambled to clear a path. Connor marched toward the archway carrying his weeping wife. As he passed me, he stopped for a fraction of a second. His face was twisted into a mask of pure venomous rage. He glared at me, his eyes burning with the desperate hatred of a man who had just lost his entire empire. "If anything happens to my child, you are a murderer." Imani, Connor spat, his voice echoing in the silent hallway. "You did this. You brought this stress into our home. You are sick." He did not wait for a response. He carried Brianna out the front door, rushing down the brick steps toward his luxury SUV parked in the driveway. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, rattling the picture frames on the walls. The dining room was left in a state of hyperventilating shock. Pastor Jenkins was wiping sweat from his brow. Aunt Beatrice was gripping the edge of the table, whispering fervent prayers. The reality of the stolen church funds had been temporarily eclipsed by the visceral panic of a potential miscarriage. Brianna had successfully manipulated the entire room into forgetting that she was a thief by turning herself into a fragile victim fighting for the life of her unborn child. I turned my attention back to the head of the table. Calvin was still sitting in his leather chair, staring blankly at the wall. The sudden medical emergency had drained whatever fight he had left in him. He looked like an empty shell. But Yolanda was not empty. She was standing up from the puddle of water on the floor, her silk dress ruined, her knees scraped by the broken glass. She was shaking from head to toe, but it was no longer from fear. It was from a deep maternal rage. She slowly turned to face me. The mask of the pious church-going mother was completely gone. She looked at me with a level of pure, unadulterated hatred that took my breath away. Yolanda walked towards me, stepping over the scattered manila folders that contained the proof of her crimes. She stopped just 2 feet away from me. She raised a trembling hand and pointed her index finger directly at my face. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "If she loses this baby," Yolanda hissed, her voice dropping to a low, terrifying register, "if the stress of your vicious, jealous vendetta kills my grandchild, I will kill you myself, Imani. I will destroy you." She did not wait for me to answer. She turned on her heel, shoved past Sasha, and ran out the front door to follow Connor and Brianna to the hospital. The sound of tires screeching out of the driveway echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood. I stood in the devastated dining room, surrounded by the silent, judging eyes of my extended family. They did not know what to think anymore. They knew my parents were thieves, but the theatrics of the medical emergency had successfully planted a seed of doubt. They were wondering if I really was a bitter, vindictive woman who had pushed her pregnant sister too far. I looked at Sasha. She raised an eyebrow, waiting for my instruction. The game was not over. Brianna thought she could use a fake hospital trip to escape the consequences of her actions. She thought she could hide behind the sterile walls of an emergency room until the dust settled. She had no idea that I already had her medical file. Let us go, I said, adjusting the lapels of my emerald green suit. We have a hospital to visit. I slid into the passenger seat of Sasha luxury sedan before the dust in my parents' driveway had even settled. Brianna thought she had won. She thought that throwing herself onto the hardwood floor and screaming about a fictional medical emergency would wipe the slate clean. She believed the spectacle of a potential miscarriage would grant her total amnesty from the fact that she and her husband had committed federal wire fraud. She expected me to retreat to my penthouse in shame, while the extended family gathered at the hospital to pray for her fake unborn child. She was banking on the unwritten rule of our community that a medical crisis automatically overrides all previous sins. But Brianna had severely underestimated my resolve. I was not playing by the rules of suburban family politics anymore. Follow that SUV, I told Sasha, pointing through the windshield, as Connor sped down the street taking a sharp right turn toward the main highway. Do not let them out of your sight. Sasha did not ask any questions. She simply shifted the car into drive and accelerated down the street, her designer sunglasses reflecting the afternoon sun. We are not letting them control the narrative, Sasha stated, keeping her eyes fixed on the tail lights of the vehicle ahead of us. If we leave them alone in that hospital waiting room, your mother will spend the next 4 hours calling every single member of your church, spreading the lie that your jealousy caused a medical tragedy. We have to be there to drop the final hammer. I nodded, watching the suburban houses blur past my window. My emerald green suit was perfectly pristine without a single wrinkle. I felt a profound sense of clarity. For 33 years, I had watched my sister use tears and fabricated illnesses to escape the consequences of her actions. Every time she missed a curfew, every time she failed a class, every time she maxed out a credit card, there was always a sudden migraine or a mysterious fainting spell. Yolanda and Calvin would immediately drop whatever punishment they had planned and rush to coddle their golden child. I was always pushed to the side, told to be quiet, and scolded for lacking empathy. Today was the absolute end of that generational cycle. We pulled into the emergency room parking lot of Atlanta General Hospital, just minutes behind them. Connor had abandoned his expensive SUV right in the drop-off zone, leaving the hazard lights blinking frantically. I stepped out of the car, the humid Georgia air hitting my face. Sasha walked right beside me, carrying her sleek leather briefcase like a lethal weapon. We walked through the sliding automatic doors of the emergency room, and the chaotic noise of the hospital immediately surrounded us. The waiting room was packed with people, but my family was impossible to miss. Connor was standing at the triage desk, shouting at a completely exhausted intake nurse. He was waving his arms aggressively, demanding that his corporate platinum insurance granted him immediate access to a private suite. He was throwing around his old money privilege, treating the hospital staff like incompetent servants. Calvin was standing near a row of plastic chairs, looking pale and entirely useless. I was staring at the linoleum floor, completely stripped of his patriarchal authority, still processing the fact that his church treasury theft had just been exposed to his entire congregation. And then there was Yolanda. My mother was pacing back and forth near the double doors leading to the trauma bay. Her expensive silk dress was ruined, stained with the dirty water from the shattered crystal goblets. Her hair was disheveled and her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She was muttering frantic prayers under her breath, begging God to save her precious grandchild. Then she turned her head and saw me standing in the center of the waiting room. The prayers stopped instantly. The frantic pacing ceased. Yolanda locked eyes with me, and the sheer volume of hatred radiating from her face was enough to make the air in the room turn ice cold. She did not see a daughter who had just been robbed. She only saw the villain who had dared to hold her golden child accountable. "You followed us here!" Yolanda shrieked, her voice carrying over the noise of the crowded waiting room. People turned their heads, staring at the unfolding drama. "You wicked, vindictive girl! Have you not done enough damage for one day?" She charged at me. She literally lunged across the waiting room, her hands raised, her fingers curled like claws, ready to strike my face. She wanted to physically assault me in the middle of a hospital to punish me for shattering her perfect social facade. I did not flinch. I did not step back. As she brought her hand down to slap me across the face, I raised my left arm and caught her wrist mid-air. My grip was solid, unyielding, and completely devoid of fear. The physical impact sent a shockwave up my arm, but I held her wrist suspended between us, refusing to let her overpower me. Yolanda gasped, struggling against my grip. "Let go of me," she spat, struggling to pull her arm away. "You are a monster, Imani. If my daughter loses her baby because of your vicious lies, I will never forgive you." I leaned in close, so only she could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "Do not play the devoted protective mother with me, Yolanda. You do not care about hospitals, and you certainly do not care about medical emergencies. You only care about performances." I released her wrist, giving her a firm push backward so she stumbled away from me. I smoothed the lapel of my green suit, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "You are standing here weeping over a fictional pregnancy just to save face," I said, my voice projecting clearly, so Calvin could hear every single word. "But let us talk about your actual track record with medical emergencies, Mom. Let us talk about what happened when I was 16 years old." Yolanda rubbed her wrist, her eyes darting around nervously as she realized I was not going to back down and hide from the public attention. "Be quiet, Imani. You are embarrassing the family." "There is no family left to embarrass." I shot back, taking a step toward her. "When I was 16, I was admitted to this exact same emergency room with a severe case of pneumonia. My fever was 104 degrees. I could barely breathe. The doctors were worried my lungs were going to fill with fluid. Do you remember where you were that night, Mom?" Calvin looked up from the floor, his expression shifting uncomfortably. Yolanda swallowed hard, refusing to answer me. "I will tell you where you were," I continued, my tone relentless. "You were 50 miles away at Brianna Regional Cheerleading Competition. The hospital called you 3 times, telling you your eldest daughter was in critical condition and struggling to breathe on a plastic gurney. And you told the charge nurse that you could not leave because Brianna's squad was up next, and you needed to record her routine. You left me alone in a hospital bed with a cafeteria sandwich and a plastic cup of water while I was coughing up blood. You did not come to see me until the next afternoon because you took Brianna out for celebratory ice cream first." Several people in the waiting room gasped, whispering to each other as they watched the immaculate suburban mother being exposed for the monster she truly was. Yolanda opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. The truth was an absolute defense, and she knew it. "You do not care about sick children, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You only care about the spotlight. And right now, Brianna is giving you the ultimate stage to play the grieving victim. But the show is over." Connor stormed over from the triage desk, having heard the end of my confrontation. He stepped in front of Yolanda, puffing his chest out to intimidate me. "What is wrong with you, Imani?" Connor demanded, his face red with anger and stress. "Your sister is back there fighting for our child, and you followed us here to pick a fight over ancient history. You are truly a sick woman. You need psychiatric help." I looked at the wealthy, arrogant white man who had stolen my home and laughed softly. "I am not the one who needs help, Connor. You are. Because you are defending a woman who has been playing you for a fool since the day you put a ring on her finger." Before Connor could formulate a response, the heavy double doors leading to the back examination rooms swung open. A triage nurse wearing blue scrubs walked into the waiting room holding a digital tablet. She looked extremely confused, her brow furrowed as she scanned the digital chart in her hands. She looked up and scanned the waiting area. "Family of Brianna Sterling," the nurse called out, her voice hesitant. Connor rushed forward, instantly playing the role of the devoted, panicked husband. "I am her husband," he said frantically. "How is she? Is the baby okay? Please tell me my wife is all right." The nurse looked at Connor, then looked back down at her tablet, as if the words on the screen were written in a foreign language. She shifted her weight uncomfortably clearly out of her depth. "Sir," she began, her voice dropping to a cautious, professional volume. "I need to ask you to come back to the consultation room with me. The attending physician needs to speak with you in private regarding your wife's medical history. It seems there is a discrepancy with her intake forms." Connor frowned, his panic shifting into defensive confusion. "A discrepancy? What are you talking about? Just tell me if my baby is safe." The nurse looked around the crowded waiting room, clearly unwilling to violate privacy protocols, but equally unable to process the bizarre medical reality she had just discovered in the examination room. "Sir, please," she insisted, gesturing towards the doors. We just need a moment of your time in private. I did not let him walk away. I did not let Brianna maintain the illusion for another second. I stepped right in between Connor and the confused triage nurse. Sasha moved seamlessly beside me, opening her leather briefcase with a satisfying click. "Hein does not need privacy," I said, looking directly into Connor's eyes. "He needs the truth." The triage nurse took a physical step backward, clutching her digital tablet tightly against her blue scrubs. She looked frantically between me, Sasha, and Connor. Her eyes were wide with professional panic. "Excuse me," the nurse stammered, her voice wavering. "I cannot allow you to interfere. I am required by federal privacy laws to speak only with the husband regarding the patient." "I am not asking you to violate federal privacy laws," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and completely unbothered. "I am simply saving you the extreme discomfort of trying to figure out how to tell a frantic husband that his wife is not currently experiencing a miscarriage. And the reason you are struggling to find the right compassionate medical terminology right now is because her initial blood work just came back from the lab. You are standing here trying to process how a woman who claims to be losing a child has absolutely zero trace of the human chorionic gonadotropin hormone in her system. She is not pregnant. She has not been pregnant." The nurse froze. The color drained from her face. She looked down at her tablet and then back up at Connor, entirely incapable of masking her shock. Her silence was a louder confirmation than any spoken word could have ever been. Connor whipped his head around to stare at the nurse. His chest was heaving, his expensive tailored shirt stained with sweat from the humid Atlanta afternoon. "Tell me she is lying," Connor demanded, his voice cracking with a desperate, aggressive edge. "Tell me this vindictive woman is making up lies about my wife." The nurse swallowed hard, taking another step back toward the secure double doors. "Sir, I really need you to come back to the private consultation room. The attending physician must be the one to discuss these lab results with you." Connor did not move. He seemed entirely paralyzed by the sheer weight of the nurse refusing to confirm his impending fatherhood. Sasha stepped forward. The sharp click of her leather briefcase opening echoed like a gunshot in the tense waiting area. She reached inside and pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with a red legal sticker. She handed the envelope to me without a single word, her face a mask of absolute corporate ruthlessness. I held the sealed document out toward my brother-in-law. "He doesn't need privacy," I said, locking eyes with the man who had confidently tried to steal my penthouse just a week ago. "He needs the truth. And unfortunately for you, Connor, the truth does not care about your feelings." Connor stared at the envelope as if it were coated in poison. "What is that?" he hissed, his hands remaining rigidly at his sides. "This is a legally obtained discovery document." I explained, my voice echoing clearly, so Yolanda and Calvin could hear every single syllable from where they stood trembling by the plastic waiting room chairs. "When the Securities and Exchange Commission raided your Midtown office last week, they froze all of your marital assets. My legal team immediately filed an emergency injunction to separate my commercial real estate holding from your fraudulent portfolio. During that financial audit, the forensic accountants had to track every single dollar flowing in and out of the joint accounts belonging to you and Brianna." Connor snatched the thick envelope from my hands. He ripped the red seal open, tearing the heavy paper in his frantic haste. He pulled out a stack of financial logs, highlighted banking statements, and printed email transcripts. "Your legal team thought they were just looking for the money you stole from your investors." I continued, watching his eyes dart frantically across the first page. But what they found was a secondary shadow account entirely controlled by Brianna. "You see, Connor, you are not the only one in your marriage who knows how to hide money." Yolanda rushed forward, her ruined silk dress rustling loudly. She tried to swat the documents out of Connor's hands, but Sasha swiftly blocked her path, inserting her own body between my mother and the paperwork. "Do not listen to her, Connor," Yolanda shrieked, her voice raw and desperate. "Imani fabricated those papers. She hired someone to fake those bank statements just to ruin your beautiful marriage. Brianna loves you. She is carrying your heir." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that cut right through my mother's frantic delusions. "She is not carrying an heir, Mom. She is carrying $250,000 in underground gambling debt." Connor's head snapped up. His eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying mixture of shock and dawning realization. Gambling, he whispered the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. Turn to page 4. Connor, I instructed, folding my arms across the crisp emerald fabric of my suit. You thought Brianna was spending her afternoons shopping at Phipps Plaza and having lunch at the country club. You thought she was just a high-maintenance suburban housewife draining your credit cards on designer shoes. But she was not at the mall, Connor. She was sitting in the VIP rooms of illegal underground baccarat and poker tables operating right here in Atlanta. She lost $50,000 in one single weekend last October. She lost another $80,000 right before Christmas. Connor's hands began to shake violently. The papers rattled in his grip as he flipped through the highlighted bank statements. He was reading the exact dates, the massive cash withdrawals, the desperate transfers from their joint savings into untraceable cryptocurrency wallets. She owed dangerous people a lot of money, I said, my tone relentless. And she knew your hedge fund was bleeding institutional cash. She felt the shift in your behavior, Connor. She knew you were quietly liquidating assets to build a flight fund in the Cayman Islands. She realized you were preparing to abandon the sinking ship, and she knew that if you left her behind, the people she owed money to would come directly to her front door to collect. Yolanda grabbed her own hair, shaking her head in violent denial. No, my daughter is a respectable woman. She does not gamble. She does not associate with criminals. You are making this up to destroy her reputation. Your respectable daughter has a severe gambling addiction, Mom. I fired back, staring my mother down. And she was desperate. She needed a way to lock Connor down. She needed an anchor to guarantee that he would either take her with him to the Caribbean or at least pay off her massive debts before he vanished. So she played the oldest trick in the book. She bought a fake positive pregnancy test. She ripped ultrasound photos off a random Pinterest board. She played the role of the glowing expectant mother to secure her financial safety net. Connor stopped reading. He slowly lowered the stack of papers. The transformation in his face was genuinely terrifying to witness. The arrogant, privileged finance executive was completely gone. In his place stood a man who realized his entire existence for the past 4 years had been a calculated predatory grift. He had risked federal prison to maintain a lifestyle for a woman who was actively scamming him while he was scamming his own investors. He had destroyed his legacy for a wife who used a fictional unborn child as leverage to pay off an underground casino syndicate. A deep, guttural sound escaped Connor's throat. It was not a sob. It was the sound of a man fundamentally breaking. His face turned an angry, violent shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk tie. Connor, Yolanda whimpered, taking a cautious step toward him. Connor, please, you have to let Brianna explain. Connor did not even acknowledge my mother. He dropped the heavy stack of financial documents right onto the linoleum floor. The papers scattered across the waiting room, highlighting the undeniable proof of Brianna deception for anyone who cared to look. He turned his body entirely away from the triage desk. He ignored the terrified nurse who was now actively backing away toward the security station. He ignored my father, who was standing frozen by the vending machines. Connor stormed past the nurse, breaching the restricted area of the emergency room without a single ounce of hesitation. He marched down the sterile white hallway, his heavy Italian leather shoes striking the floor with explosive force. I stood right where I was watching the inevitable collision. Sasha stood beside me, her posture perfectly straight, her eyes locked on the unfolding destruction. Yolanda screamed for him to stop, but her voice was completely drowned out by the sheer force of what happened next. Connor reached the end of the hallway. He did not turn the handle. He raised his foot and violently kicked the heavy wooden door of Examination Room 4 completely off its hinges. The heavy wooden door slammed violently against a metal medical cart, sending a tray of sterile instruments crashing to the linoleum floor. Connor marched into Examination Room 4 like a man possessed. Brianna was sitting on the edge of the examination bed, clutching a small paper cup of water. She had her head bowed, attempting to look like a fragile, heartbroken mother in the midst of a tragic medical crisis. But the second Connor threw the thick stack of financial documents directly into her face, the performance ended. The papers scattered across her lap and fluttered to the hospital floor. Brianna let out a sharp sp, looking down at the highlighted bank statements proving her underground gambling debts. Her perfectly manicured hands dropped the paper cup, spilling water all over her designer shoes. $250,000. Connor roared, his voice echoing off the sterile white walls. You faked a pregnancy to trap me into paying off $250,000 in illegal casino debts. Yolanda and Calvin had finally caught up to us in the hallway. They pushed past me and Sasha, rushing to the doorway just in time to see the golden child completely drop her fragile victim act. Brianna did not cry. She did not beg for forgiveness. She looked at the bank statements, looked at her furious husband, and her face instantly hardened into a mask of pure vicious survival. Do not you stand there and act like you are the victim here, Connor! Brianna shrieked, sliding off the examination bed and stepping right into his personal space. You have been lying to me since the day we got married. You promised me a lifestyle. You promised me security. And what did I get? I got a broke fraud running a Ponzi scheme who was actively packing his bags to abandon me in Atlanta while he fled to the Cayman Islands. You are a parasite. Connor spat back, pointing a shaking finger at her forehead. I compromised my entire firm to keep you draped in diamonds and flying first class. I risked federal prison because you could not stop swiping your credit cards, and you repay me by faking a child. I am done with you, Brianna. I am calling my lawyers right now. I am filing for divorce, and I am leaving you with absolutely nothing. You can deal with the bookies and the casino thugs all by yourself. Brianna laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound that chilled the room. Leave me with nothing, she mocked, throwing her hands in the air. You have nothing left to take, Connor. Your accounts are frozen, your firm is raided, you are just a broke criminal in a nice suit. Yolanda rushed into the room, grabbing Brianna by the shoulders. Brianna, stop it! Yolanda cried desperately, trying to salvage the wreckage of her social ambitions. Just apologize to him. We can fix this. Connor, we can sell my jewelry, we can take out a second mortgage on the house. Just do not leave her. Brianna violently shoved our mother away. Shut up, Mom! Brianna screamed. You are the reason I am in this mess. You raised me to find a rich white man to pay for my life. You taught me that looks and luxury were the only things that mattered. You told me to secure the bag by any means necessary. So I did what you taught me to do. And you handed me a worthless criminal who cannot even protect his own bank accounts. Calvin stepped into the room, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. He grabbed Connor by the arm, trying to use his booming pastoral voice to regain control of the situation. Connorson, listen to me, Calvin pleaded. We cannot let the family fall apart like this. If you divorce Brianna, you sever our legal ties. I need you to replace the church funds you promised me. If you walk away, I have no cover story for the auditors. I will go to jail. Connor ripped his arm out of my father's grasp, looking at Calvin with absolute disgust. You are going to jail anyway, old man, Connor snarled. You handed me a stolen deed. You embezzled from your own congregation. You are just as dirty as I am, but you are too stupid to realize you are already dead. I am not going down for your incompetent family. I am getting out of here. Connor turned on his heel and stormed out of the examination room. He shoved past Sasha and me in the hallway, his shoulder knocking hard against the wall as he pulled his cell phone from his pocket. He was frantically dialing his divorce attorney, desperately trying to secure his own exit strategy before the reality of his financial ruin fully set in. I stood my ground, watching the panicked, arrogant man march down the hospital corridor, back toward the main waiting room. Yolanda was sobbing loudly inside the exam room, clutching her chest while Brianna yelled at Calvin for being a useless father. The toxicity of their dynamic had finally reached its boiling point, consuming them all in a spectacular inferno of greed and betrayal. But the show was not over. Connor pushed through the swinging doors leading into the main triage lobby, holding his phone to his ear. I walked right behind him, Sasha staying perfectly in step with me. I wanted to see his face when he realized there was no exit strategy left to play. As Connor reached the center of the crowded waiting area, the automatic glass doors at the front entrance slid open. They did not open for a patient or a paramedic. A team of 6 men wearing dark windbreakers stepped into the emergency room. The bright fluorescent lights caught the gold badges clipped to their belts. Leading the group was a tall, sharp-eyed man with a completely uncompromising posture. It was Special Agent Hayes from the Financial Crimes Task Force, the same man I had on speakerphone back at the Penthouse. Connor froze mid-stride. The phone slipped slightly from his ear. His arrogant, aggressive momentum completely evaporated. He stared at the federal agents walking through the hospital lobby, and the absolute terror in his eyes was glorious to witness. Agent Hayes did not look around. He did not ask the triage nurse for directions. He locked eyes with Connor and walked directly toward him. The crowded waiting room fell into a stunned silence as patients and hospital staff realized what was happening. Yolanda and Calvin had rushed out of the hallway just in time to see the federal agents fan out across the lobby. Calvin stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. Yolanda let out a soft, horrified gasp, grabbing the sleeve of Calvin's suit. Connor tried to take a step backward, but two agents smoothly moved around the seating area, blocking his only path to the exit. Agent Hayes stopped exactly 2 feet in front of my brother-in-law. "Connor Sterling, Agent," Hayes said, his voice projecting with crisp, deadly authority across the silent hospital waiting room. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Connor opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He slowly lowered his phone and raised his hands, trembling violently as he turned around. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing in the quiet lobby was the most satisfying sound I had heard in my entire life. As Connor was being secured, Agent Hayes turned his head and looked directly at my father. 2 other agents immediately moved past the triage desk and flanked Calvin, grabbing him by both arms. "What are you doing?" Calvin shouted, trying weakly to pull away. "I am a respected member of this community. I am a church treasurer. You cannot do this to me in a hospital." The agents ignored his pathetic protests and slammed him against the wall, securing his wrists behind his back with a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Yolanda shrieked, throwing her hands over her mouth as the patriarch of her perfect suburban family was restrained like a common criminal in front of dozens of staring strangers. Agent Hayes pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Connor Sterling, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering." He turned his cold gaze to my father. "Calvin Washington, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and embezzlement of institutional funds. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Brianna walked out of the hallway, her face streaked with ruined makeup. She saw her wealthy husband and her protective father standing in the center of the hospital lobby, wearing federal handcuffs. The fake medical emergency, the stolen church funds, the offshore accounts, the stolen penthouse deed, it had all culminated in this exact moment. I stood by the vending machines, my arms crossed over my emerald green suit, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. They had mocked me. They had called me a homeless person. They had tried to paint me as an unstable, vindictive woman in front of my entire community. But the truth was undeniably clear, and the federal government had just delivered the punchline to their arrogant jokes. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked around the wrists belonging to my father. Calvin, the proud, untouchable patriarch of our suburban community, was being manhandled by federal agents right in front of the hospital vending machines. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to use the same booming voice he used to command the church congregation. "You are making a terrible mistake," Calvin stammered, his knees buckling slightly as Agent Hayes spun him around to search his pockets. "I demand to call my attorney. I know the mayor. I have standing in this city." Agent Hayes did not even blink. "Your local political connections do not mean absolutely anything to the Department of Justice, Mr. Washington. You can name-drop the mayor all you want while you sit in a federal holding cell. Move." Connor was faring even worse. The arrogant white finance executive who had looked me dead in the eye and told me to take the loss was currently weeping. Real, actual tears were streaming down his face as 2 agents forced him to walk toward the sliding glass doors. He looked back at Brianna, who was standing completely frozen by the triage desk. "Call the firm!" Connor shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Tell them to liquidate the emergency trust. Tell them I need the retainer for the defense team. Brianna, do not just stand there." Brianna did not move a single muscle. She watched the man she had faked a pregnancy for, the man she had racked up $250,000 in illegal gambling debt for, being dragged out of the hospital lobby. She realized instantly that Connor was no longer her ticket to luxury. He was a sinking ship, and Brianna had spent her entire life learning how to survive by jumping onto the nearest lifeboat. She turned her face away, refusing to look at her husband as the federal agents shoved him through the automatic doors. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on Yolanda. Her husband was going to federal prison. Her son-in-law was going to federal prison. The stolen church funds, the forged penthouse deed, the offshore accounts, it was all unraveling in real time. The perfect wealthy image she had spent decades curating was dead. Yolanda spun around and locked her panicked eyes on me. I was still standing perfectly still in my emerald green suit, Sasha standing silently right beside me. Yolanda closed the distance between us in 3 frantic steps. She did not yell. She did not insult me. She did the one thing I never thought I would see her do in my entire lifetime. My mother dropped to her knees right there on the dirty hospital linoleum. "Imani, please," Yolanda sobbed, reaching out and grabbing the tailored fabric of my pants. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the green material. "You have to stop this. You have the money. You have the connections. You can call these federal agents off and tell them it was just a misunderstanding over the property deed. You can hire the best defense lawyers in Atlanta for your father. Please, Imani. We are family. You cannot let them take my husband away." I looked down at the woman who had made my entire existence a miserable competition I was never allowed to win. I looked at the mother who had eagerly signed away my home just to keep a designer bag on her golden child arm. "Family," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue like poison. "You want to talk about family right now, Mom?" Where was this desperate loyalty when I was 22 years old and my first business venture went under? I was $50 short on my rent. I called you crying, begging you for a $50 loan so I would not get evicted from my studio apartment. Do you remember what you told me while you were sitting in the salon getting a $200 silk press? Yolanda shook her head violently, tears ruining her expensive foundation. That was different, Imani. You needed to learn how to be financially responsible. I was trying to teach you a lesson about the real world. I stepped back, forcing her hands to slide off my suit. You taught me the lesson perfectly, Mom. You told me that I was a grown woman and my problems were my own. You told me that a strong black woman does not beg for handouts. You let me get an eviction notice taped to my front door, while you took Brianna on a weekend shopping trip to Miami. You did not care if I ended up sleeping in my car, because I was not the daughter you wanted to show off to the church elders. "Imani, please," Yolanda wailed, pressing her hands together in a begging motion. "I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything. Just write the check for the bail money. You are a millionaire. It is nothing to you. You can save this family right now. If you do not help us, they will take the house. They will take everything." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no remorse. The emotional manipulation that used to control my every move had completely lost its power. "I would, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and remarkably cold. "I really would write that check for the bail money. But unfortunately, you sold my penthouse. I am just a homeless person, remember?" Yolanda gasped as the words hit her. The exact insult my father had thrown in my face just a week ago was now the final nail in their coffin. I turned on my heel, the sharp click of my stilettos echoing against the floor. "Come on, Sasha," I said, not looking back a single time. "We have a company to run." I walked out of the hospital emergency room, stepping out into the warm Atlanta evening. I left my mother crying on the floor. I left my sister standing alone amidst the wreckage of her own lies. I got into Sasha luxury sedan and drove away from the toxic wasteland they had created. Weeks passed, and the fallout was absolute carnage. The local news stations picked up the story immediately. Prominent Atlanta church treasurer arrested in $1 million federal sting operation. The headlines were relentless. The Congregation of Greater Hope Fellowship held an emergency meeting and publicly ousted my parents from the church entirely. The community building fund had been completely drained, and the resulting scandal destroyed whatever remaining social capital Calvin and Yolanda possessed. My legal team moved swiftly and ruthlessly. Since the federal government had seized the offshore accounts where Connor hid the money from my penthouse sale, Sasha filed a motion to sever my business assets from the criminal forfeiture. We provided the court with the undeniable proof that my parents had committed forgery using a revoked power of attorney. The judge immediately nullified the sale of my commercial property, returning the penthouse legally back to my limited liability company. But the criminal justice system moves at its own methodical pace. 3 weeks after the dramatic arrests at the hospital, the federal bail hearing finally arrived. I walked into the downtown Atlanta federal courthouse, wearing a sharp charcoal suit. Sasha walked beside me, carrying her ever-present leather briefcase. We took our seats in the gallery directly behind the prosecution table. I was not there as a defendant. I was there as the primary victim of the wire fraud, and I wanted a front-row seat to watch the empire burn to ash. Calvin and Connor were led into the courtroom wearing matching Orange County jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were shackled. The arrogance that had defined their entire existence was completely scrubbed away. Calvin looked like he aged 20 years in 3 weeks. His hair was unkempt, his posture stooped. Connor looked terrified, his eyes darting frantically around the wood-paneled courtroom. Yolanda was sitting in the front row of the gallery, looking like a ghost. She had lost her suburban mansion to foreclosure proceedings after the feds froze the accounts. She was currently living in a cheap extended stay motel, but she still showed up to court, hoping against hope that her family could somehow talk their way out of a federal indictment. But the true spectacle of the morning was not the men in orange jumpsuits. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Brianna walked down the center aisle. My sister did not look like the glamorous, wealthy socialite she had pretended to be for the past 4 years. She was dressed in a modest, conservative navy blue dress. Her hair was pulled back into a simple low bun. She wore no jewelry, no designer labels, and practically no makeup. She looked like a fragile, terrified victim. It was a masterclass in visual manipulation. Brianna had not been arrested at the hospital, but she was deeply implicated in the financial audit. The prosecution had subpoenaed her to testify regarding her knowledge of the stolen funds and the forged penthouse deed. She walked past her husband without even looking at him. She ignored my father. She stepped up to the witness stand, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the whole truth. I leaned forward in my gallery seat, watching my sister carefully. Brianna was a survivor. She had no money left, no wealthy husband to protect her, and no parents capable of bailing her out. She was backed into a corner, and I knew exactly what a golden child did when they were finally forced to face the consequences of their actions. The federal prosecutor stood up and approached the podium, looking directly at my sister. "Mrs. Sterling," the prosecutor began, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. "You are here today under a limited immunity agreement. You have claimed that you had absolutely no knowledge of the fraudulent real estate transaction involving your sister property. You have also claimed that you were completely unaware that your husband, Connor Sterling, was using embezzled church funds to support your household expenses. Is that correct?" Brianna gripped the edges of the wooden witness stand. She let out a soft, trembling breath, allowing a single tear to roll down her cheek. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice shaking with perfect vulnerability. "I had no idea. My father and my husband handled all the finances. They told me the money came from legitimate investments. I trusted them. I was just a naive wife trying to support my family. They manipulated me." Yolanda gasped from the front row, her hands flying to her mouth. Calvin stared at his favorite daughter, his eyes wide with absolute betrayal. Brianna was preparing to send them both to prison just to walk away clean. The heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom remained closed, sealing us inside a room built for absolute justice. I sat in the wooden gallery pews, wearing a sharp-tailored charcoal suit. My posture was perfectly straight, and my expression was entirely unbothered. I was not there as a defendant facing the wrath of the United States government. I was sitting directly behind the prosecution table as the primary victim of a massive financial fraud. I had a front-row seat to watch the complete destruction of the people who had treated me like a disposable resource my entire life. Sasha sat right beside me, her leather briefcase resting on the wooden table. We watched as the federal marshals led Calvin and Connor into the courtroom. The two men were wearing matching bright Orange County jumpsuits. Their wrists were shackled to chains around their waists, and their ankles shuffled heavily against the carpeted floor. The arrogant patriarchal authority that Calvin had used to dominate our family for 3 decades was completely gone. He looked shrunken and exhausted, his hair unkempt, and his shoulders stooped under the weight of his impending prison sentence. Connor looked even worse. The wealthy white finance executive who had smugly told me to take the loss in my own living room was now trembling uncontrollably. His eyes darted around the courtroom, filled with the naked terror of a man who realized his old money privilege could not buy his way out of a federal indictment. Yolanda was sitting in the front row of the gallery, just a few feet away from me. My mother looked like a hollow ghost of the woman she used to be. She had lost her sprawling suburban mansion to the federal asset freeze and was currently living in a cheap extended-stay motel. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple faded dress. But she still showed up to the bail hearing, clinging to the desperate delusion that her family could somehow talk their way out of this nightmare. The true spectacle of the morning began when the side doors opened and Brianna walked into the room. My younger sister did not look like the glamorous, wealthy socialite who threw lavish parties funded by stolen church money. She had completely stripped away her luxurious aesthetic. She was wearing a modest, conservative navy blue dress that fell below her knees. Her hair was pulled back into a simple low bun, without a single piece of jewelry on her body. She looked like a fragile, terrified victim who had accidentally stumbled into a world of crime. It was a masterclass in visual manipulation and psychological deception. Brianna had not been arrested at the hospital, but she was deeply implicated in the forensic financial audit. The prosecution had subpoenaed her to testify regarding her knowledge of the stolen community building funds and the forged penthouse deed. She walked past her shackled husband without even glancing in his direction. She ignored our father sitting at the defense table. She stepped up to the wooden witness stand, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the whole truth under penalty of perjury. I leaned forward in my gallery seat, watching my sister carefully. Brianna was a survivor above all else. She had no stolen money left to spend, no wealthy husband to protect her, and no parents capable of bailing her out of trouble. She was backed into a corner, and I knew exactly what a golden child did when they were finally forced to face the consequences of their own actions. They found someone else to take the fall. The federal prosecutor stood up and approached the wooden podium, looking directly at my sister. He asked her to state her name for the record, and then he immediately began his questioning. The prosecutor asked her if she had any prior knowledge of the fraudulent real estate transaction involving the commercial property belonging to her sister. He asked her if she was aware that her husband Connor was using embezzled church funds to support their luxury lifestyle and pay off her underground gambling debts. Brianna gripped the edges of the wooden witness stand. She took a slow, trembling breath and allowed a single, perfectly timed tear to roll down her cheek. She whispered her answers into the microphone, her voice shaking with calculated vulnerability. She swore under oath that she had absolutely no idea where the money came from. She claimed that Connor managed all of the household finances and actively hid his bank statements from her. She pointed a shaking finger at Calvin and sobbed loudly. She told the judge that her own father had used her name on the forged property documents without her permission and dragged her into his church embezzlement scheme to save his own reputation. She painted herself as an innocent knave housewife who was completely manipulated by the two men she trusted most in the world. It was a flawless performance of a victimized daughter and a betrayed wife. Yolanda gasped from the gallery, pressing her hands to her mouth in horror as she watched her golden child throw her own father into the fire. Calvin stared at his favorite daughter, his eyes wide with absolute betrayal, realizing she was actively testifying to send him to federal prison just to secure her own immunity deal. The federal prosecutor stepped back, writing notes on his legal pad. Brianna wiped her eyes with a tissue, looking up at the judge with an expression of pure, innocent pleading. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully manipulated the federal court the exact same way she had manipulated our parents her entire life. She was wrong. Sasha stood up from the table right in front of me. She did not ask the judge for permission to cross-examine the witness. Sasha represented me, the victim of the wire fraud, and she had been working directly with the prosecution team to share discovery evidence. Sasha walked up to the federal prosecutor and handed him a small encrypted digital drive. The prosecutor reviewed the attached documentation, verifying the strict chain of custody from the electronic devices seized during the raid on the Midtown hedge fund office. The prosecutor turned back to the judge and requested permission to submit a newly unsealed piece of digital discovery evidence. He explained that the evidence was retrieved directly from a hidden folder on the iCloud account belonging to Connor. The judge granted the request immediately. The courtroom bailiff took the digital drive and connected it to the central audio system of the courtroom. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on Brianna. The confident, fragile victim act began to crack. Her posture stiffened and she looked nervously at Connor. Connor just closed his eyes and lowered his head toward the defense table, knowing exactly what was about to play. The audio file began to play over the loud courtroom speakers. It was a saved voicemail message. The voice echoing through the silent room was not fragile or terrified or naive. It was cold, calculating, and completely ruthless. It was the undeniable voice of my sister Brianna. The voicemail had been left for Connor months ago, right before the sale of my penthouse. Everyone in the courtroom heard Brianna explicitly ordering her husband to use the revoked power of attorney to steal my commercial property immediately. We heard her laughing, a vicious, cruel sound, as she mocked the idea of leaving me homeless on the streets of Atlanta. She called me a bitter, lonely spinster who deserved to lose everything because I refused to share my tech wealth with her. But the ultimate betrayal came at the end of the recording. Brianna told Connor that if the federal investigators ever started looking into their sudden cash flow, they would simply pin the entire illegal operation on Calvin and Yolanda. We heard Brianna explicitly detail her plan to frame our parents for the wire fraud. She laughed into the phone and called our father a gullible old fool who would sign anything if it meant keeping up his status at the church. She called Yolanda a pathetic social climber who was so desperate to protect her favorite child that she would willingly take the fall without even realizing she was being set up. The audio recording stopped. The silence that followed in the federal courtroom was absolute and completely suffocating. Brianna stared blankly at the speaker system mounted on the wall. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a pale, frozen statue. The carefully constructed, modest victim persona she had worn into the courtroom had just been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She had committed blatant perjury on a federal witness stand, and she had done it right after leaving an audio trail proving she was the mastermind behind the entire conspiracy to defraud the government and frame her own family. I slowly turned my head to look at Yolanda sitting in the front row of the gallery. For 33 years, my mother had treated Brianna like a flawless deity. Yolanda had drained my college savings account, covered up the teenage car accidents committed by Brianna, and happily sold my commercial property just to keep a smile on the face of her precious golden child. Yolanda had sacrificed her own moral compass, her marriage and her relationship with me just to maintain the illusion of Brianna perfection. Now Yolanda sat in a quiet federal courtroom, having just listened to a high-definition recording of that exact same golden child, calling her a pathetic social climber and actively plotting to send her to federal prison to save her own skin. The profound betrayal completely broke the mind of my mother. Yolanda stood up from the wooden pew, her hands trembling violently at her sides. She did not weep for her daughter. She did not fall to her knees and pray for divine intervention. She let out a sound that was entirely primal, a deep, agonizing scream of pure maternal devastation that instantly morphed into absolute unhinged rage. Yolanda vaulted over the low wooden barrier, separating the public gallery from the legal defense area. She completely ignored the shouting bailiffs rushing down the aisles. She lunged straight at the elevated witness stand, her hands reaching out like claws. She grabbed Brianna by the collar of her modest navy blue dress and dragged her half out of the wooden enclosure. Yolanda was screaming hysterically, calling Brianna an ungrateful monster and a vicious parasite. She screamed that she had sacrificed her entire life, her home, and her oldest daughter just to protect a deceitful snake who wanted to throw her in a cage. Brianna shrieked in terror, clawing frantically at the hands belonging to Yolanda, trying desperately to break free from the violent grip of our mother. The courtroom erupted into total, unprecedented chaos. The federal marshals rushed forward from all sides, grabbing Yolanda by the arms and shoulders, physically restraining her and dragging the furious mother and her weeping golden child apart. The federal judge slammed his wooden gavel repeatedly against the bench, demanding immediate order in his courtroom. He was completely disgusted by the toxic, violent display. He was a federal judge who dealt with hardened cartel leaders and violent syndicates. But the sheer venomous toxicity of this suburban family dispute deeply offended the dignity of his courtroom. The marshals forced Yolanda back into the gallery section, pushing her toward the exit doors. The judge looked down at the defense table, his expression carved from stone. He addressed the court with a booming voice that commanded absolute silence. The judge stated clearly for the record that the witness, Brianna Sterling, had just committed blatant intentional perjury on a federal witness stand. He stated that the audio evidence proved she was actively involved as a primary conspirator to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and the framing of innocent parties. The judge formally revoked her limited immunity agreement right on the spot, stripping away her only legal protection. He looked at Connor and Calvin sitting frozen in their orange jumpsuits. The judge stated that given the existence of offshore Cayman accounts and the highly coordinated family effort to defraud both the government and the victim, they all represented a severe flight risk and an active ongoing danger to the community. The judge slammed his gavel down one final time. He denied bail for Calvin, he denied bail for Connor, and he ordered the federal marshals to take Brianna into federal custody immediately for perjury and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The marshals moved in without hesitation. They grabbed Brianna by the arms, pulling them forcefully behind her back. They slapped heavy steel handcuffs onto her wrists right there in her modest conservative dress. Brianna sobbed hysterically, begging the judge for mercy, begging Connor to help her, begging anyone to save her from the consequences she had finally brought upon herself. No one answered her pleas. Yolanda was escorted entirely out of the courtroom by armed security, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. My mother had lost her suburban mansion, her husband, the respect of her church, and the illusion of her perfect daughter in a single catastrophic afternoon. She was walking out into the world with absolutely nothing left to her name. I sat comfortably in the wooden gallery pew, watching the federal marshals lead my father, my brother-in-law, and my sister away through the heavy side door leading to the holding cells. The empire of lies and favoritism they had built over 3 decades was completely burned to ash, leaving nothing but the cold, hard truth behind. I stood up from my seat, smoothing the crisp fabric of my charcoal suit. I looked at Sasha, who gave me a silent, respectful nod. I turned around and walked out of the federal courtroom, my head held high, feeling a profound, complete, and absolute sense of freedom. 3 months passed since that day in the federal courthouse. The wheels of the justice system usually grind slowly, but when the government is handed an airtight case built on offshore wire fraud and stolen institutional funds, the gavel comes down with terrifying speed. I did not have to lift another finger. I simply went back to running my tech company, while the prosecution dismantled my family piece by piece. The sentencing was a bloodbath. Connor received a severe federal prison sentence for racketeering and wire fraud. His old money connections completely evaporated the moment the Securities and Exchange Commission formally seized his firm. His wealthy parents publicly disowned him to protect their own social standing, leaving him to rot in a federal facility without a single dime for a high-priced appeal. Calvin did not fare much better. The man who had demanded total submission from his family and total respect from his congregation was sentenced to a substantial term in federal prison for embezzling the community building funds. The judge made a specific point during sentencing to highlight the profound hypocrisy of a church leader robbing his own flock to fund a fraudulent luxury lifestyle. My father was stripped of his tailored suits, and his booming pastoral authority reduced to just another inmate with a federal identification number. Brianna managed to avoid a prison cell, but her punishment was arguably worse for someone whose entire identity was built on wealth and status. Because she had committed perjury and actively conspired in the forgery, she was handed a strict probation sentence. But the IRS did not offer her any leniency. The government seized absolutely everything: her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, her jewelry, and every single bank account associated with her name were liquidated to pay back the stolen church funds. Connor filed for a rapid annulment from behind bars, leaving her drowning in legal fees. The golden child was left utterly destitute without a single asset to her name. Yolanda avoided a criminal indictment because Brianna and Calvin had orchestrated the actual fraud, but my mother was left financially bankrupt. Her bank accounts were frozen, and her social standing in Atlanta was entirely annihilated. The church members she had looked down upon for years turned their backs on her. Stripped of her wealthy son-in-law and her powerful husband, Yolanda had nowhere left to hide. She assumed she could just retreat to the sprawling suburban family home and wait for the storm to pass. She thought she could hide behind those heavy oak doors and live off the charity of whatever distant relatives she could still manipulate. But Yolanda forgot about the blackmail threat Calvin had thrown in my face on the street outside my penthouse. 10 years ago, when my credit was spotless and theirs was ruined by my father and his failed business ventures, they used my social security number to co-sign the mortgage on that massive suburban house. Calvin had threatened to stop paying the mortgage to ruin my credit and destroy my federal business clearance if I did not drop the charges. It was a vicious, desperate threat. But my legal team and my financial advisors did not just sit back and wait for the bank to send a default notice. When the federal government froze my parents' accounts, the mortgage immediately went into arrears. But I did not just pay off the missed payments to save my credit score. Sasha contacted the primary lender directly. Because my name was legally bound to the property, and the primary borrowers were currently facing federal fraud convictions, the bank was highly motivated to offload the toxic asset. I used the capital from my company to legally buy the distressed debt entirely. I purchased the mortgage outright. I did not just save my credit, I became the sole undisputed legal owner of my childhood home. The very house where they had belittled me, compared me to Brianna, and treated me like a second-class citizen was now my personal property. I drove up the winding driveway of the suburban estate in my brand-new sports car. The meticulously manicured lawn was starting to overgrow, and the expensive vehicles that used to line the driveway were all gone, repossessed by the banks. I parked my car right in front of the brick steps. I was not alone. I was flanked by two massive private security guards wearing dark suits and a fully equipped contractor crew wearing hard hats and carrying heavy demolition tools. I walked up to the heavy oak front door. I did not knock. I reached into my designer bag and pulled out the original brass key I had kept on my keyring since high school. I slid it into the lock and pushed the door open. The inside of the house smelled like stale air and desperation. I walked into the grand foyer, my heels clicking sharply against the marble tiles. From the living room I could hear the bitter, exhausted voices of Yolanda and Brianna arguing with each other. They were blaming each other for the lack of food in the refrigerator and the final notices arriving in the mail. I stepped into the living room, the security guards and the contractor crew filing in silently behind me. Yolanda and Brianna froze. They were sitting on the expensive white sofas wearing cheap faded sweatpants. The glamorous styling they had maintained for years was completely gone. They looked exhausted, pale, and thoroughly defeated. When Yolanda saw me standing there, a brief, pathetic flicker of hope sparked in her eyes. She actually thought I had come to save them. She stood up, smoothing her wrinkled shirt, her voice trembling. "Imani, you came. I knew you would not just abandon us here. We have nothing left to eat. The electricity is about to be shut off. Please tell me you brought your checkbook." I did not smile. I did not offer any comfort. I reached into my tailored jacket, pulled out a crisp, legally binding document, and dropped it flat onto the glass coffee table right in front of her. "This is a formal eviction notice," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of warmth. "You defaulted on the mortgage, Yolanda. The bank was going to foreclose, but I bought the debt. This house belongs entirely to me now, and I want you off my property." Brianna stood up, her face twisting into a mask of sudden, furious panic. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is our home. We have nowhere else to go. You cannot just throw your own mother and sister out onto the street." I looked directly at the golden child. "You sold my penthouse while I was on vacation, Brianna. You forged my signature and tried to leave me homeless because you wanted to pay off illegal casino debts. Do not you dare stand in my living room and preach to me about what family is supposed to do. You have exactly 30 minutes to pack whatever fits into a standard trash bag. Everything else left in this house is going straight to the county dump." Yolanda gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. 30 minutes, Imani, please. I have antique furniture in here. I have expensive family heirlooms. I have my entire wardrobe. You cannot expect us to pack our lives into garbage bags. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. Do you remember when I was 17, Yolanda? I came home from working a double shift at the diner and found all of my belongings stuffed into black garbage bags on the front porch. You told me my bedroom was not tidy enough and that Brianna needed my closet space for her new pageant outfits. You made me sleep on the living room floor for a month. I suggest you go to the kitchen and find some heavy-duty bags. The clock is ticking. Brianna tried to lunge at me, screaming obscenities, but the two private security guards immediately stepped forward, blocking her path with their imposing frames. They did not touch her, but their presence was a solid, immovable wall. Brianna shrank back, realizing instantly that she had absolutely no power left. She could not manipulate these men. She could not call her father to protect her. She had to face the brutal, uncompromising reality of her situation, reduced to absolutely nothing. The golden child and her enabler mother walked into the kitchen with their heads bowed. They pulled cheap black plastic garbage bags from under the sink. I stood in the center of the living room watching the two women who had tormented me for my entire life, frantically stuffing their remaining cheap clothes and basic toiletries into the bags. They were weeping quietly, the reality of their total social and financial execution finally breaking their spirits. They dragged their plastic bags to the front door, looking like the pathetic criminals they truly were. Yolanda stopped by the foyer table, looking back at me with eyes full of desperate regret. "Imani, please," Yolanda whispered, her voice cracking. "Where are we supposed to go?" "That sounds like a problem for someone who actually cares, Mom," I replied, crossing my arms. "Your 30 minutes are up. Get off my porch." They walked out the front door, the heavy plastic bags dragging against the brick steps. But before they could even reach the bottom of the walkway, I turned to the foreman of my contractor crew. I gave him a single sharp nod. The foreman blew a sharp whistle. The crew stepped forward, raising their heavy steel sledgehammers into the air. With a synchronized violent swing, they smashed the heavy tools directly into the pristine custom drywall of the living room. The sound of tearing wood and shattering plaster echoed like a bomb going off. They swung again and again, physically destroying the shrine of my painful childhood right in front of my mother and sister. Yolanda and Brianna flinched at the loud, destructive noise, turning around to watch the walls of their precious suburban kingdom being violently ripped apart. The perfectly painted room where they had staged their fake family photos, where they had mocked my career choices, where they had plotted to steal my inheritance was turning into rubble and dust. I stood on the front porch, holding a cup of hot coffee I had brought from my car. I watched Yolanda and Brianna drag their garbage bags down the long, winding driveway toward a cheap, battered rideshare car they had called. No neighbors came out to help them. No church members pulled up to offer them shelter. They had burned every single bridge they ever had. They had no money, no status, no church community, and no family left to exploit. They were driving off into absolute obscurity. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the cool afternoon breeze against my face. For generations, Black women in our community have been conditioned to endure toxic familial abuse under the heavy oppressive disguise of loyalty. We are told to be the strong ones, the mules of the family, expected to sacrifice our peace, our resources, and our sanity to protect relatives who would not cross a puddle for us. We are told to forgive the unforgivable, to turn the other cheek, and to keep the family secrets buried deep to protect the public image. I refuse to carry that generational curse. I refuse to be the scapegoat for a golden child who was nothing but a parasite. I broke the cycle. I did not turn the other cheek, and I did not suffer in silence. I held up a massive, unyielding mirror, and I let the sheer ugliness of their own greed completely destroy them. I watched the cheap ride-share car turn the corner and disappear from sight. The past was officially gone. I turned around, stepping back into the house that was currently being gutted to the studs by my demolition crew. I was going to completely renovate this property, erase every single memory of Calvin and Yolanda, and flip it for a massive commercial profit. I walked out the front door and locked it securely behind me. I walked down the brick steps and got into my new sports car, the engine roaring to life with a powerful, satisfying hum. I pulled out of the suburban driveway, pointing my car back toward the city skyline. I was driving back to my newly reclaimed, fully secured luxury penthouse. The air inside the car was crisp and clear. The constant demanding noise of my toxic family was permanently silenced. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror, seeing a wealthy, successful, untouchable woman. Looking back at me, I was finally completely free. The most profound lesson to draw from this story is that true family is defined by mutual respect and protection, not by shared genetics or social obligations. When toxic relatives disguise financial abuse and emotional manipulation as familial loyalty, you owe them absolutely nothing. Do not allow anyone to weaponize your achievements to cover their own failures. Standing your ground against those who expect you to suffer for their comfort is not a betrayal. It is an act of essential self-preservation. If this story resonated with your own experiences of setting firm boundaries against toxic family members, please leave a comment down below sharing your journey and hit the subscribe button to join our supportive community.